When her father died in the autumn of 1884, Amos Kettering left his daughter a single folded page of measurements, a half-finished ridge pole propped against the north wall of the soddy, and one written instruction that had to be carried out before the first hard freeze. He had not said why. He had not said how. He had drawn a rough diagram in the margin, no larger than a man's thumbnail, and beside it he had written the words, in a hand that was already shaking by then, "Plant it thick and let it root." That was all. That was the whole of what he had left her, apart from the land itself and the low, half-sunken house he had raised with his own back some 11 years before, and the wind that came off the flat country west of the Loo River and asked nothing of anyone but their bones. Her name was Hetty Kettering. She was 26 years old that autumn, and she had lived every one of those years within sight of the same low rise of grass. The country around her belonged to a stretch of central Nebraska that had not yet decided whether it was farmland or prairie, and the people who had come to settle it had not yet decided either. Some of them had brought lumber up from Grand Island. Some of them had cut sod. A few, like her father, had done both, sinking the walls into the earth and then framing a wooden roof above, so that the house was half sunk and half standing, the way a stubborn man will sometimes be half kneeling and half rising at the same time. The soddy sat on the north edge of a shallow draw. Behind it, the ground climbed a little, not enough to call a hill, only enough to gather snow in winter, and to send water down its face in spring. In front of it, the prairie ran out toward the horizon in a long, flat exhalation of grass. There was a well 30 paces from the door, and a hen coop leaning against the west wall, and a stunted cottonwood her father had planted the year she was born, and that was the whole of the place. Hetty had buried him on a Thursday. The nearest preacher came out from the town of Fenner's Crossing, 7 miles east, and read what needed reading, and drank the coffee she made him, and left without saying much else. Her mother had been dead since Hetty was 9. She had no brothers. She had a sister 2 years older who had married a saddler and gone to live in Omaha, and who had written once after the funeral to say that Hetty was welcome to come east if the winter proved too much. Hetty folded the letter and put it in the tin box under the bed where she kept the deed and her father's notes and a small pouch of seed her mother had gathered the summer before she died. She did not answer the letter. She read her father's page every night for a week. She read it in the yellow light of the tallow lamp, sitting at the plank table with her elbows on the wood and her thumbnail worrying about the corner of the paper. The measurements she understood. He wanted the ridge pole braced a certain way. He wanted the sod cut in blocks of specific depth, cured on the north side of the house for at least 4 weeks, and laid in a pattern he had sketched in short, decisive strokes. She understood the geometry of it, roughly. What she did not understand was the instruction at the bottom. Plant it thick and let it root. Plant what? Plant it where? Plant it in what? She turned the page over. She held it to the lamp. There was nothing on the back but a smudge of graphite where his hand had rested. She unfolded the little diagram in the margin and stared at it until her eyes watered. It looked like nothing. It looked like a scattered handful of small marks above the outline of a roof. She thought at first it was rain. She thought later it was frost. She could not, for the life of her, make it mean anything else. She did not ask anyone about it. She had a notion, even then, that whatever her father had meant, he had not meant it for the town. The first man to laugh was Reverend Coombs, and he did not mean to be cruel. He came out 3 weeks after the funeral to see how she was managing, which was his obligation, and also, she suspected, his curiosity, and he stood in the yard with his hat held against his chest and looked at the half-finished ridge pole propped against the north wall. He asked her what she meant to do with it. She said she meant to finish it. He nodded the way a man nods when he is deciding whether to say the next thing or leave it alone. Then he said the next thing. He said that her father, God rest him, had been a good man and careful one, but that in his last year he had gotten strange notions, and that a young woman alone in a soddy would do better to bank the walls and shutter the windows and sit the winter out, and come spring, sell the place to a man who could work it properly. She thanked him for his concern. She did not tell him about the page. The second person to laugh was Elsie Duffy, who ran the post office out of the front room of her husband's dry goods store in Fenner's Crossing, and who had been Hetty's mother's closest friend before the fever took her. Elsie was not cruel either. Elsie was practical. When Hetty came into town for salt and a spool of black thread in the second week of October, Elsie leaned across the counter and asked her, softly, whether she had given any more thought to going to Omaha. Hetty said she had not. Elsie said that Amos, God love him, had been a fine man with a good heart, but that the last year of his life he'd spent all his savings on seed no one had heard of and had talked at times like a man who was reading a book no one else could see, and that whatever he had been building out there behind the soddy, it was not worth a young woman's winter. Hetty said she would think about it. She thought about it the whole ride home, and by the time she reached the yard, she had not changed her mind about anything. But Elsie's words sat in her chest like a splinter she could not quite reach. Whatever he had been building. Not a seed no one had heard of. The book no one else could see. Her father had never bought seed from Elsie's husband. He had bought his seed from a peddler who came through every June, a small, dark man from somewhere south of the Platte, who spoke with an accent Hetty could not place, and who carried his wares in tin canisters lashed to the sides of a mule. She had liked him. Her father had liked him. He had not come through this past summer, and she had not thought anything of it until now. The third person to laugh was the worst, because he was the one who had known her father best. His name was Wendell Marsh, and he had homesteaded the section south of theirs since Hetty was a child. He had helped her father raise the walls of the soddy. He had eaten at their table more Sundays than she could count. He was 58 years old that autumn, and he had a face like a piece of tack leather that had been left in rain and then dried again, and he came riding into the yard on a slat-sided bay mare in the last week of October, and dismounted without a word, and walked straight to the half-finished ridge pole, and put his hand on it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. He said, "Hetty, your father was the best friend I ever had on this prairie, and I loved him like a brother. But he was wrong about this. He was wrong about all of it. He read things in almanacs that were meant for other countries. He listened to men who did not know Nebraska. Whatever he told you to finish out here, do not finish it. Sell the wood. Bank the walls. Come spring, we will talk about the land." She did not answer him at first. She looked at the ridge pole. She looked at his hand on it. His hand was steady, and his eyes were not unkind, and he had known her father in ways she never would. She felt the splinter in her chest turn sideways. She said, "I told him I would finish it." Wendell Marsh took his hand off the ridge pole. He nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he's closing a door he does not want to close. He said, "Then I hope you know what he wants, girl. Because I do not." He rode out that afternoon. She did not see him again for a long time. She stood in the yard after he was gone, and looked at the ridge pole, and at the sky, which had begun to take on the pale, high, streaky look that Nebraska skies took on in the last weeks before the first hard weather. She could smell wood smoke from a marsh place drifting north, and she could smell the dry grass, and she could smell the well when the wind turned right, that particular mineral coldness that came up from deep water. She stood there until the light began to slant, and then she went inside and took the page down from the shelf and read it again. Plant it thick and let it root. That night she did something she had not done since the funeral. She went into the small back room of the soddy, the one her father had used to store tools and seed and the odds and ends of 30 years of frontier accumulation, and she began to go through it methodically. She was looking for the peddler's canisters. She was looking for whatever her father had bought that Elsie Duffy had never seen. She found them behind a crate of horseshoes, stacked 3 deep, and covered with a piece of oilcloth. 6 tin canisters, each about the size of a coffee tin, each labeled in a spidery hand she did not recognize. She could not read what the labels said. They were in a language she did not know. She thought at first it might be German, but she had seen German writing before in the Kruger family's Bible over near the Cedar Creek, and this was not it. It was rounder. It curled at the ends of certain letters. She looked at it and could not place it. She opened the first canister. Inside were small dark seeds, tightly packed and folded paper. She unfolded the paper. It was covered in her father's handwriting. It said at the top, in his careful blockish letters, "Prairie House Leak," and beneath that, "Plant along the south face, and let it spread." Beneath that, a line she read 3 times before she understood. Beneath that, a note, half erased, that said, "Vasily says the roof also. Try the roof. Vasily." She sat down on the packed dirt floor of the back room and held the paper in her lap. Vasily, the peddler, small and dark, with the accent she could not place. Vasily had told her father to plant something on the roof. Vasily, who had not come through this past summer. She opened the other canisters one by one. Each one held a different seed. Each one had a note in her father's hand. One said sedum, and beneath it, the words "winter green, roof fit will not rot." One said yarrow, and beneath it, "hold the sod." One said prairie clover, deep roots, wind break. The 5th and 6th were labeled in words her father had spelled phonetically from what she guessed Vasily had told him, Zayatstrav and Michelin. Beside those he had written question marks. She sat there until the tallow lamp began to gutter, and the chill from the packed earth had traveled up through her skirt and into her bones. Then she stood up, and she gathered the canisters into her arms, and she carried them to the front room and set them on the table beside the folded page. Plant it thick and let it root. She understood, now, part of what her father had meant. She did not yet understand the rest. She did not know why a roof needed planting, or what house leek and sedum and yarrow and clover would do against a Nebraska winter, or what he had been building toward. But she understood that whatever it was, he had been building toward it for a long time, and that he had not spoken of it to Wendell Marsh, or to Elsie Duffy, or to Reverend Coombs, or to anyone else in Fenner's Crossing. He had spoken of it only to a small, dark man on a mule. She went to bed that night, and did not sleep for a long time. She lay in her father's bed, which was now her bed, and listened to the sound of the wind moving through the dry cottonwood outside, and to the small settling sounds of the soddy walls, and to the ticking of the tin roof over the front room where the frame extended past the sod. She thought about Vasily. She thought about a man who came once a year from somewhere south of the Platte, carrying seed in tin canisters, and who had taught her father a thing that no one else in the county knew. She thought about the word root, and the way her father had underlined it twice. The next morning she began to work. She began first with the sod itself. Her father's notes were specific about the depth of the blocks and the pattern of the laying. She sharpened the sod cutter he had left leaning against the north wall, and she went out to the low place at the far end of the draw where the grass grew densest and its roots ran deepest, and she began to cut. The work was slow. A sod block cut properly is heavy in a way that surprises people who have never lifted one. Is not the weight of earth alone. It is the weight of 1,000 years of grass having decided patiently to be part of that earth. She lifted them one at a time and carried them on a small sledge to the north side of the soddy, and there she stacked them the way her father had drawn in the diagram, grass side down for the first course, grass side up for the second, alternating so that the roots of one interlocked with the roots of the next. It was not the way most sod was cured for a roof. Most sod in that country was laid grass side down uniformly. Her father's pattern was different, and she could not see why yet, but she did as he had drawn. She cut sod for 6 days. On the 7th, she rested her back because it had begun to complain in a voice she could not ignore, and she spent the day inside sorting through the canisters and reading her father's notes and trying to make sense of the way the seeds were meant to be combined. Her hands blistered and healed and blistered again. Her palms took on a shine, and then a callus, and then a deeper callus that she could feel through her gloves. Her shoulders learned a new kind of ache. She ate cornbread and cold beans standing up at the counter because she was too tired to sit. She slept the sleep of the dead and woke at first light and started again. On the 10th day, she finished the ridgepole. It was not perfectly plumb. She had raised it alone, using her father's block-and-tackle rig lashed to the cottonwood, and a series of small wedges she drove in one at a time to lift into place, and by the time it was seated in its notches, she was shaking so hard she could not hold a cup of coffee steady. But it held. She stood in the yard and looked up at it and felt something she had not felt since her father died, which was a small, clean pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion. She heard hoofbeats. She turned. Wendell Marsh was coming up the road on the slat-sided bay. He dismounted and stood beside her and looked up at the ridge. "Pull." He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "You raised that alone?" She said yes. He nodded once. He looked at the sod stacks curing on the north side. He looked at the diagram she had scratched into the dirt beside the wall to help her keep track of the pattern. He looked at her hands. He said, "Hetty, come home with me. My wife will make up the loft. You can winter with us and come back to this in the spring." She said, "I told him I would finish it." Wendell Marsh looked at her for a long time. Then he did something she had not expected. He took off his hat, and he held it against his chest the way he had held it at her father's funeral, and he said he was a stubborn son of a bitch. "He passed it on to you." She almost smiled. She did not quit. He put his hat back on. He said, "If you need anything, you know where I am." He rode out. She stood in the yard and watched him go. She felt the ridge pole above her, and she felt the sod stacked at her back, and she felt the wind coming down off the rise behind the house, and she thought, for the first time, that she was not going to finish this in time. There was too much left. The frame still needed its cross members. The sod still needed to be laid. And she had not yet begun to plant anything. That afternoon she sat down at the table with her father's page, and she counted on her fingers the days between the present and the historical average of the first hard frost in that country. She had 18 if she was lucky, 16 if she was not. She sharpened the axe. She worked from the 11th day forward in a way she had never worked before. She rose an hour before first light, and lit the tallow lamp, and ate standing up, and was outside before the sky was more than a pale gray band above the eastern horizon. She worked until the light was gone. She worked in a slow, methodical rhythm that she learned by feel, a rhythm that did not tire her the way frantic labor would have. She had watched her father work like this her whole life. She had not understood, until now, that it was a skill, that there was a way of moving one's body across a long day that let the day be long without breaking you. She laid the cross members. She laid the first course of sod on the frame, grass side down as her father's diagram showed, and then she laid the second course on top of it, grass side up. The roots interlocked. She could feel them catching each other as she pressed each block into place. It was like sewing, she thought. It was very heavy, very slow sewing. By the 15th day, she had the roof 3/4 covered. On the 16th day, in the middle of the afternoon, she looked up from her work and saw a horseman coming down the road from the west. He was not a man she knew. He rode a small mule. She stopped where she was on the ladder against the north wall, and she watched him come. He was small and dark. He wore a broad, flat-brimmed hat and a coat that had been mended in many places. He rode slowly. He rode the way a man rides who has ridden a great many miles and has learned that no destination is worth breaking a mule for. He stopped in the yard and looked up at her on the roof. He said, in an accent she recognized before her mind did, "You are Kettering's daughter." She climbed down. She stood in the yard in front of him. She said, He said, "I am sorry for your father. He was a good man. I did not know until Grand Island. I came as soon as I could." She said, "You are Vasily." He looked surprised. He nodded slowly. He said, "He wrote to me?" She said, "He kept your seed." Vasily dismounted. He was shorter than she was by half a head. He walked to the north wall and put his hand against a sod block and rubbed his thumb across the roots the way a man might feel the grain of good wood. He looked up at the roof. He looked at her. He said, "You laid it in the pattern." She said, "Yes." He said, "You know why?" She said, "No. I do not know why. I did what he drew." Vasily was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Come inside. I will tell you what I told him." They sat at the plank table in the front room. She made coffee. He drank it black. He held the tin cup in both hands the way a man does who has been cold more often than warm in his life, and he began to speak. He spoke slowly in careful English, choosing his words the way a man chooses stones for a path. He said he had come from a country far east of hers, in the steppe lands south of a great sea. He said the winters there were long and hard and dry, and the wind came without stopping for months, and the peasants had learned, over many generations, to build their houses half into the ground and to cover them with a living roof. He said the living roof was the trick. He said that a roof of sod alone would insulate a house for a season, but that its roots died over time, and the sod dried, and the wind stripped it, and the rain broke it, and after 2 or 3 years it was no better than dry earth on planks. But a roof, planted with the right herbs, houseleek, stonecrop, yarrow, prairie clover, and certain small tough grasses whose names he gave her in his own language, and then translated hairgrass, mouseflower, a roof planted with those, and let alone to root, would knit itself into a thing that was neither sod nor plant nor stone, but something of all three. The roots would grow down into the sod. The sod would hold the roots. In summer, the flowers would bloom and hold water in their thick leaves. In autumn, the leaves would fall and pack down into a mat. In winter, that mat, frozen, would become a shell of ice and root that no wind could strip and no rain could break. He said in his country, a house with a living roof stood 100 years. He said the winter could not get in through a roof that was still, in some way, alive. He said her father had understood this the first time Vasily had explained it, 6 years before. He said her father had bought seed from him every summer since. He said her father had been building, one course at a time, one season at a time, toward a roof that would carry a living skin. She said he never told anyone. Vasily shrugged, the small, careful shrug of a man who has seen many towns. He said, men do not like what they did not think of. They sat for a long time. The coffee cooled in their cups. Outside the light began to fall. He said, you have how many days? She said 12. Perhaps fewer. He said, it is enough. If you plant now. if you plant thickly. He stayed 3 days. He would not take payment. He said he had owed her father a debt that had not been about money, and that the debt was now hers, and that he was paying it to her by paying it to the roof. On the first day, he showed her how to prepare the sod for planting, how to score the surface with a knife in a crosshatch pattern that let the seeds fall into small pockets rather than blowing away. On the second day, he showed her the ratio, how much of each seed to mix, and how to broadcast the mixture, and then press it in with the flat of a plank. On the third day, he helped her carry water from the well, and dampen the whole roof, twice, so that the seeds would settle into the sod before the first frost sealed them there. At the end of the third day, he mounted his mule, and adjusted his hat, and looked up at the roof one last time. He said, "In spring you will see it. It will look like the prairie forgot itself on your roof. Let it. Do not cut it. Do not tidy it. Let it be what it is." She said, "What if the frost comes before it roots?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then the roots will hold the seeds until spring, and the seeds will root then, and the roof will be one season behind, but will still be a living roof. You have not lost it. You have only slowed it." She said, "And this winter?" He said, "This winter the sod itself will hold. Your father laid it in the pattern. The pattern is old. The pattern was old before my country was a country. You will be warm." He rode out. She watched him go until he was a small, dark shape against the western horizon, and then she watched the horizon for a while longer, because she did not want to turn around and face the empty yard. The first snow came 4 days later. It was not the hard weather. It was a light powder that dusted the yard and melted by noon. But it was a signal. It was a message from a sky that the season had turned and would not turn back. She stood in the yard that morning and looked up at her roof and saw the small green shoots of houseleek and sedum breaking through the pressed sod in 100 places, and she felt something in her chest that she could not name, a sensation that was part grief and part vindication and part something older than either. She wrote in the small notebook her father had kept his figures in. She wrote the date, and she wrote, "First snow," and she wrote, "Shoots visible." She thought about her father. She thought about him kneeling on this roof, one autumn or another, laying sod in a pattern he had learned from a small dark man on a mule. She thought about him not telling anyone. She thought about him leaving her a page with 3 lines of instruction and a diagram no larger than his thumbnail. She thought he trusted me to figure it out. She thought he trusted me more than he trusted the town. She went inside. The weeks that followed passed in a rhythm she came to know well. She cut wood. She banked the walls. She dug the last of the potatoes and turnips and stored them in the root pit her father had lined with straw 10 years before. She patched the hen coop. She salted the pork. She read her father's page every night by the tallow lamp and could recite it, now without looking. She could see the diagram in the margin without opening the paper. She saw Wendell Marsh once more in the middle of November. He rode up to the yard on a bright, cold afternoon and dismounted and stood looking at the roof with an expression she could not read. He said, "What is that on your roof, girl?" She said, "Houseleek, sedum, yarrow, prairie clover." He said, "Why?" She said, "My father wanted it." Wendell Marsh looked up at the roof for a long time. The wildflowers were beginning to show, small yellow buttons of yarrow, still blooming late, and the fleshy green rosettes of houseleek, and the first purple heads of clover pushing through where the roots had taken best. It looked, she supposed, like a garden had climbed the north wall and decided to stay on the roof. He said, "Hetty." She said, "Yes." He said, "You know they are laughing at you in town." She said, "I know." He said, "Elsie Duffy says you have gone strange like your father." She said, "Elsie Duffy did not know my father." Wendell Marsh looked at her. He looked at the roof. He looked at her hands, which were cracked and rough and stained to the nails with sod and seed. He said at last, "I hope he was right, girl. For your sake." He rode out. She did not answer him. She stood in the yard and watched him go, and then she looked up at the roof, and she watched the wind move through the wildflowers and the shoots of stone crops that had rooted in the pressed sod, and she thought he was right. He was right about this. Whatever else he was wrong about, he was right about this. She did not yet know how right. Fenner's Crossing laughed at her through November and into December. She heard about it from a boy who came out with a bundle of mail once a fortnight, the son of the blacksmith, a good-hearted 12-year-old who did not know how to keep a secret and did not know that some things should not be repeated. He told her on his second visit that Mrs. Duffy called her place the flower coffin. He told her on his third visit that some of the men at the mill had started a joke about how her father had died and left her a hat garden. She thanked him for the mail and did not react, and after that he stopped repeating what he heard, which she thought was kind of him. She did not go into town in December. She had what she needed. She had enough salt and flour and lamp oil and coffee to last through February, if she was careful, and she could last through March if she stretched. She had 6 hens still laying. She had a milk cow, a placid Jersey named Bessie, who had been her father's pride, and who had produced steadily even through his illness, and she had a small stack of firewood behind the north wall, and a larger one under a canvas tarp against the west, and she had the roof. The wildflowers were still blooming when the first hard frost came, in the second week of December. She woke that morning to a stillness that felt different from ordinary cold. She dressed and went outside and stood in the yard, and she saw that the yarrow on her roof had been touched at last by a heavy frost. The small yellow flower heads were rimmed in white. The house leek rosettes had drawn themselves closer to the sod. The prairie clover had begun to fold its purple heads down toward the pressed earth. She stood there for a long time. She had thought she would feel sad to see the flowers go. She did not feel sad. She felt something more like witness, which was a word she did not have then, but which she understood, in her body, was what she was doing. She was watching a thing happen that her father had watched, or would have watched, if he had lived one more year. She was standing where he would have stood. She went inside. She wrote in the notebook. First hard frost. The roof holds. The winter was quiet through the rest of December. There was one snowstorm a week before Christmas, but it was ordinary weather, and she managed it without difficulty. She cooked a small supper on Christmas Eve, a piece of pork, potatoes, bread she had baked that afternoon, a mug of coffee with the last of the cream Bessie had given her. She sat at the plank table alone and ate slowly. She thought about her father. She did not cry. She had not cried since the funeral, and she did not begin now. She thought that grief sometimes was a thing you did with your hands and not with your eyes. She had been doing it with her hands for 3 months. It was working. She read her father's page one more time before she went to bed. She had memorized it entirely now, but she read it anyway. Plant it thick and let it root. She said the words aloud, softly, to no one. She slept. The ice storm began on the 9th of January, in the small hours of the morning, and no one in central Nebraska was ready for it. There had been signs, if a person had known how to read them. The barometer, if a person had one, she did not, had been falling since the 6th. The cattle at the marsh place had begun to gather in the low corner of the pasture 2 days before, huddling in a way that Wendell would later say he should have paid more attention to. The geese had gone through overhead 3 weeks earlier than in any year Hetty could remember. The moon on the 8th had worn a ring so wide it took up half the sky. She noticed the moon. She did not know what it meant. She wrote it in the notebook, ring around the moon, wide, and she went to bed and slept a shallow sleep, waking twice in the night to hear the wind against the west wall, which was not unusual, but which she noted anyway. She woke at the third waking to a sound she did not recognize. It was not wind. It was not rain. It was a soft, continuous, glassy ticking, as if a great many small stones were being thrown against a tin roof over the front room. She lay still for a moment. Then she rose and pulled on her boots and her coat and opened the door. The air was warmer than it had been the night before, which was strange. The wind was steady from the northeast, and the sky was falling, not as snow, but as a fine, hard, wet rain that froze the instant it touched anything solid. The step outside her door was already a sheet of clear ice. The cottonwood in the yard was already glazed. She could hear, in the distance, a low creaking sound she could not place at first, and then she realized it was the sound of trees, everywhere, in every direction, beginning to bend under weight. She closed the door. She stood inside with her hand still on the latch. Ice storm. She had lived through 2 of them in her life. The first had been when she was 6. The second when she was 14. Both had done damage. The second had killed a family east of Fenner's Crossing when a tree came through their roof. But those had been ordinary storms. This one felt different from the first moment. This one felt as if the whole sky had decided all at once to lay itself down on the country. She lit the lamp. She checked the wood stack inside. She had enough to last 4 days if she was careful, and she banked the fire low and steady, and did not build it up. She checked the water in the covered bucket beside the stove. She checked the hens, who were quiet on their roost in the coop against the west wall, protected by the bank of earth she had piled there in November. She checked Bessie in the small lean-to shed she had built onto the north side. Bessie looked at her with her placid brown eyes, and chewed her cud, and did not seem alarmed. Hetty stood with her forehead against the cow's warm flank for a moment, and then went back inside. She sat at the plank table and listened. The ticking on the tin roof of the front room grew louder through the morning. By noon it was a steady, hissing roar. By afternoon it was a sound she could no longer hear individual drops within. It was one continuous glassy pressure. She could not see out the window because the glass was covered in ice half an inch thick. She could not open the door because the ice had sealed it against the frame. She used a knife to chip a hole in the frost on the inside of the window and looked out. The cottonwood was down. The main trunk had split at a height of about 8 feet, and the top half had come down across the yard, so heavy with ice it looked like a chandelier that had fallen from a great height. The hen coop was buried. She could not see well. She could not see, from that window, whether the roof of the soddy was holding. But she could feel it. She could feel it because the room she was in was warm, dry, and quiet. The tin roof over the front room, the small extension her father had framed in wood 10 years before, was making a sound she did not like. It was groaning. She could hear the timbers creak. She could hear, once, a sharp crack that was not the ice outside, but the wood above her head. She moved her bedroll into the sod-walled main room. She moved the tallow lamp and her father's page and the notebook and the tin box with the deed. She moved the last of the wood inside from the west stack, hauling it in armloads through the small side door that opened onto the lee side of the house. Each trip she made was harder than the last. The ice on the ground was 2 inches thick. By evening, she fell twice. She did not break anything, but she bruised her hip badly, and by the time she had the last armload of wood inside, she was shaking with cold and effort. She barred the side door. She sat down on her bedroll in the main room, under the sod roof, and she listened. Above her, the sod was quiet. The tin roof over the front room, where she was not, cracked once more and then, at some point in the middle of the night, gave way. She heard it go. She did not go to look. She could not have done anything if she had. She heard the timbers snap, and she heard the ice load come down into what had been her father's front room, and she heard the wind rush into the space where the tin had been, and she heard, faintly, the sound of glass breaking as the window frames gave way under the sudden shift of pressure. She sat in the main room with her back against the sod wall, and she listened to her father's front room die. The sod roof above her did not make a sound. She slept a little toward dawn. When she woke, the storm was still coming down. She could hear it against the sod above her, a different sound than it had made against the tin, softer, and yet somehow more solid, as if the ice were being absorbed rather than deflected. She thought about the roots her father had planted, or had told her to plant, and about the way they had knit themselves into the sod, and about the way, Vasily had said, a living roof becomes a shell of ice and root in winter that no wind can strip and no rain can break. She thought he was right. He was right about all of it. She thought about the front room, which was gone. She stood up. She stretched her back. She banked the fire. She put on the coffee. She would not know for 2 more days how bad it was outside her walls. But she was warm, and she was dry, and she had food. She was, as far as she knew that morning, alive in the middle of a storm that had killed things larger than the cottonwood in her yard. The storm broke on the morning of the 12th. She heard the silence before she opened the door. She had spent 2 full days inside the main room, feeding the fire and reading her father's page, and writing in the notebook and eating cornbread, and drinking coffee and speaking quietly to Bessie through the small window she had cut into the wall of the lean-to, and now the sound outside had stopped. She went to the side door and worked the ice free from the frame with the point of the knife, and pushed it open. The door swung outward against a foot of glazed snow, and stuck. She pushed harder. It gave. She stepped outside. The world was made of glass. There is no other way to say it. Every surface she could see was encased in a shell of clear, heavy ice. The ground, the fallen cottonwood, the collapsed hen coop, the well cover, the split beams of what had been her front room, the fence posts, the standing dead grass, the very sky itself, which was a hard, flat gray, without depth. The light was the light of a room with too many mirrors in it. It hurt her eyes. She stood in the yard and turned in a slow circle. The front room of the soddy was gone. The tin roof had come down entirely, and the frame walls had folded inward, and the whole extension was a heap of wood and ice from which only the stove pipes still projected, canted at an angle. The main soddy, the half-sunken sod-walled main room, was intact. She turned to look at it. The roof was covered in ice, of course. Everything was. But the ice on her roof was not the same as the ice everywhere else. It had settled into the shapes of the wildflowers and the sedum and the arrow. Under the ice, she could still see, faintly, the green rosettes of the house leek. Around each shape the ice had formed a small dome, as if the plants were breathing beneath it. The whole roof looked like a garden preserved under glass. And the sod, beneath the ice, was holding. It had not sagged. It had not cracked. It had not shifted an inch. She stood in the yard for a long time. She heard, then, a sound she had not expected. It was a voice, faint and coming from the east. She turned toward it. A figure was moving along the road, or what had been the road. It was moving slowly because the ice was 2 inches thick over the ground, and every step had to be tested. She could not tell, at first, who it was. Then she could. It was Wendell Marsh. He was on foot. He had a small child in his arms, wrapped in a blanket, and behind him were 2 more figures, his wife, Anna, and their older girl, who was about 10. They were all moving together, slowly, and even from where she stood Hetty could see that they were exhausted, that they had been walking a long time, and that one of them was hurt. She went to meet them. She met them at the edge of her yard, at the place where her father had once set a stone to mark the property line. Wendell looked up as she came. His face was gray with cold, and with something else, something worse than cold. His mouth worked. He did not say anything. Anna Marsh spoke instead. Her voice was hoarse. She said, "Our roof went. 2 nights ago. We were in the smoke shed. The little one is sick." Hetty looked at the child in Wendell's arms. She could see now that the blanket was moving in a small, shallow way that meant the child was breathing. She could hear a wet sound in the breath. She said, "Come inside." She led them across her yard. She held the door open. She helped Anna over the icy step, and she took the child from Wendell's arms so that he could get himself through the doorway without falling. She brought them all into the main room of the soddy, and she stoked the fire, and she put water on for tea and for broth, and she took the blanket off the sick child and set it to dry by the stove, and she made a bed for the child on her own bedroll, and put the child down there and covered it with her own coat. Wendell Marsh stood in the middle of the room and looked at the sod ceiling above him. He looked at the walls. He looked at the fire, which was low and steady and warm. He looked at his wife and his older girl, both of whom were already sitting close to the stove, holding their raw hands out to it. He said, "Hetty." She said, "Not now, Wendell. Sit down. Eat." He sat down. They stayed with her for 4 days. In that time the ice began, slowly, to melt in the afternoons and refreeze at night, and the country began to come back. On the 2nd day the boy from the blacksmith's, older than his years now, came out on a mule with news. He told her the town of Fenner's Crossing had lost 7 roofs. He told her 3 families had lost people. He told her Elsie Duffy's husband had been killed when the beam of their store came down under the ice load. He told her Reverend Coombs had walked 8 miles through the storm to reach a family east of town and had lost the toes of his left foot. He told her, at the end, that people were asking about her. He told her they had assumed the worst because everyone knew her soddy was old, and her father was dead, and she was alone. She said, "Tell them I am well." He said, "Miss Kettering." He hesitated. He said, "Your roof." She said, "What about it?" He said, "It has flowers on it. Under the ice. I could see them from the road." She said, "Yes." He said, "Nothing else in the county has flowers on it." She said, "No. I do not suppose it does." He rode out. She watched him go. On the 4th day the Marsh family left. Wendell had walked back to their place twice by then to see what could be salvaged, and had come back the 2nd time saying that the walls were still standing, and the fire could be going again if they moved quickly. He wanted to be home before another storm. He was right to want that. They packed the little they had brought. They dressed the sick child, who was better, but still weak. They stood in the yard for a moment before they left. Wendell Marsh looked up at the roof of Hetty's soddy. The ice was beginning to break away in places, and the green of the house leak was showing through, and one small yellow head of yarrow had come up already through a crack in the glaze, defiant and small and impossible. He said, "Your father." She waited. He said, "He never told me." She said, "No." He said, "Why not?" She thought about this. She thought about Vasily. She thought about her father sitting at the plank table by the tallow lamp, night after night, writing in his careful blockish hand. She thought about the 6 canisters in the back room. She thought about the town, and about Elsie Duffy, who called her place the flower coffin, and who was now a widow herself, mourning under a roof that had failed. She said, "I do not know." Perhaps he did not think the town wanted to hear it. Wendell Marsh looked at her for a long time. He looked at the roof again. Then he nodded once, and he took his wife's arm, and he began the slow walk south. She stood in the yard and watched them go. She went back inside. She sat at the plank table. She took her father's page down from the shelf, and she unfolded it, and she read it, one more time, in the pale gray light from a window. Plant it thick, and let it root. She smoothed the page flat with the palm of her hand. She held it there for a moment. Then she folded it, along the same creases her father had made, and she put it back in the tin box under the bed. She did not tell anyone what Vasily had told her. She did not tell anyone that spring when the wildflowers came back on her roof thicker than before and rooted deeper into the sod. She did not tell anyone when Elsie Duffy came out in April on the arm of her grown son and stood in the yard and looked up at the roof and said quietly, "Amos told me once." I did not listen. Hetty only said he told me too, in his way. Elsie stayed for coffee. They spoke of small things. They did not speak of the storm. Later that spring, Hetty went back into the tin box, and she took out her father's page one last time, and she found something she had not noticed before. On the back, in the smudge of graphite where his hand had rested, she could see now, because the light was different, or because her eyes had learned, or because she was ready to see it, a small line of words. He had written them so lightly they were barely there. They said, "Only if you are reading this, you understand. That is all I could give you." She sat with the page in her lap for a long time. She did not weep. She had not wept in all of it, and she did not weep now. She folded the page, and she put it back in the box, and she did not tell anyone about the words on the back. The prairie went on. The wildflowers on her roof deepened, year by year, into a mat so thick that even in the worst summers it held its color, and even in the hardest winters it held its shape. Travelers passing on the road began to point at it. Some of them came up and asked. She told a few of them, the ones she trusted, about houseleek and stonecrop and yarrow and clover. She did not tell them about Vasily. She did not tell them about her father's page. Those were not stories for strangers. She lived on the site for 41 years. There are things a father cannot say directly. Some he does not know how. Some he does not have time for. Some he trusts to a diagram in the margin of a page, and to a daughter who will not throw it away. If this story stays with you, the next one is already waiting.